The Athletic. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Aramco F1 Focus, the podcast that aims to get you thinking about Grand Prix racing that little bit differently. My name's Tim Silvey, and once again, I'm joined by two titans of F1 analysis. First up, when he's not burning rubber on the racetrack, he's got his eyes glued to a monitor, bringing you commentary and analysis of the sport we all love. It's our resident racing driver, Alex Brundle. Alex, how are you?
Extremely well, thank you. Reversed my time zone back to UK, and I'm ready to rock and roll for a new week.
Good stuff. And also joining me, it's a man who is to F1 statistics what Lionel Messi is to football. It's the virtual statman himself, Sean Kelly, just back from Australia. How are you?
I am very good, less jet lagged than most people coming back from Australia, but it's always worth it going down under because it's one of the best organised races of the year, notwithstanding the fact that half the grid ended up in the hedge.
Yes, which we will come on to. Well, as usual, Alex and Sean will be bringing you insight into their respective performance and stat focuses. Plus, we'll also be taking a dive into the world of sustainable fuels in our Aramco Focus. So, what are we waiting for? Let's get on with focus number 1. This week, we're going to kick off with our performance focus. So, Alex, off the back of the Australian Grand Prix, what have you got for us?
Well, as you know, I like to focus in on a very specific element. Well, quite a general element in Australia, but a specific element of the races and dig a little deeper into why it's relevant to driver performance. The glaring one, the one everybody's talking about after Australia, the most red flags in any Grand Prix ever. But more importantly, a couple of sporting points about were those red flags required, were they needed, and how did the drivers respond to the various restarts that really interest me throughout the Australian Grand Prix.
Well, let's start with that point. Were all the flags needed? If you were in that race, Alex, would you feel they were justified?
I mean, let's run through them. I mean, there are a lot of people saying that the initial red flag for Alex Albon crashing his Williams on the exit of turn 6 wasn't necessary. But, you know, I'll cast your mind back a year to Suzuka. Well, not even a year to Suzuka, when the world of Formula One absolutely insisted drivers pitting from a safety car should not have to run full speed past or should not be running full speed past diggers, past equipment, past machinery, past people on the side of the racetrack. And I do think, although there were hands thrown in the air, just get your brooms out, sweep that away and send them green again. Race control will sit back in their armchairs and say to us, guys, we are doing what you asked us to do. We're not running Formula One cars who may have pitted for a safety car, despite the fact we've had a bit of a tweak of the regulations as to how fast they can go past a digger, a JCB on the racetrack. That's what you asked us to do. I do, however, think the second red flag for Kevin Magnussen was a little bit of an unnecessary one. They should have been able to scoop that debris up for me with a full safety car to give them enough space. There were limited cars pitting again at that point. The final one, of course, necessary. You've got to scoop up the carbon fiber that's sprayed all over the racetrack. So that's my feeling on the 3.
Now, I'd imagine when you have these stoppages so regularly, it's a huge challenge for not only you as a racing driver, but for the teams as well. How hard is it for the teams and the drivers to come up with the strategies mid-race to adapt to all these restarts and changes?
We look at a driver like George Russell in the Grand Prix, who'd basically gambled on a tyre change and was stacking up at the front, the two Mercedes, holding off Max Verstappen in what was going to be a very interesting, a very exciting battle. And actually then George, to all intents and purposes, makes what's quite an intelligent move for Mercedes, splitting the strategy, covering off various pit options. And then an only in Formula One regulation happens where they're all allowed to change tyres under the safety car. In no other form, I've competed in a touring car, in a grand touring car, in a sports car, and even in various other single-seater series outside the F1 paddock. Nowhere else are you allowed to do that. You come in the pits, and unless you've clearly got a puncture, you can't change the tyre. So That's such a strategic curveball for the teams. And I actually am blown away that that regulation still exists in Formula One. Yes, I understand punctures. Yes, I understand the necessity to change tyres and debris. But we've got so much information from these Formula One cars. It's a huge challenge for the teams to basically second guess.
Well, Alex, I was going to mention the possibility of punctures. I mean, are you saying you seem to be quite cynical about it? Whereas I would have thought, as a driver, you would have thought, well, surely safety first. You know, when you've got carbon fibre littering the racetrack, if we're going to have a red flag, we don't know if the punctures are going to manifest until we go back to racing speed.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to discern. It's pretty hard to say that any of the cars couldn't have a puncture at any time, right? That's part of racing, and an element of carbon fiber small enough to generate a shard of carbon fiber small enough to generate an unseen puncture is a shard of carbon fiber they're probably not going to sweep off the racetrack anyway, in realistic terms. I think with the amount of information, I mean, teams with laser information and with tire temperature and pressure information can tell within a nano of a degree the tire spread of temperature. The concept that we need to change the tires, maybe in case someone ran over maybe a small shard of carbon fiber and the team haven't noticed it, I think in modern Formula One is a bit outlandish, honestly. And for the show and for the spectators and for the strategy and for the teams, I'm not too sure on it. I know it was one that Charlie Whiting was absolutely steadfast on. But for me, I think it's time for that rule to change.
What about the mental side of things? So, you know, there's obviously mechanical issues that are thrown up with so many stoppages. But how do you deal with it from a driver's perspective? How do you deal with it mentally? How do you keep yourself in that zone so that you don't just go completely haywire?
It always amuses me because I connect so much with the feeling that the drivers have, and to watch them sort of meander. There's some very unintentional Ministry of Funny Walks that comes out of George Russell as he's wandering around, you know, sort of shooting the breeze with his mechanics and checking out the various cars. And you've got to kind of keep moving because you're still full of nerves, you're still full of energy, you're still full of adrenaline. In a longer red flag, that then starts to sink down, and it's really easy to lose that edge, and so important for the drivers to keep it. But it really interested me how the drivers responded to each individual red flag throughout the race, according to how late they were in the race and how long they'd been, because I think it really differed and demonstrated the mindset of a couple of drivers.
Alex, I was doing the trackside commentary on Sunday, and I'd mentioned before the final restart that it was nearly 5 o'clock local time when we did that final restart, at which point in Melbourne, anybody who's been to Melbourne will know this, the sun is very low in the sky, pointing directly at you as you're going down into turn one. Were you immediately aware of that? And have you been in a situation where you've had to drive in those circumstances with the sun in your eyes and think, I'm kind of on a wing and a prayer here. I'm not entirely certain that the track has not got debris on it or anything like that?
Well, you can be sure it's going to happen twice at Le Mans because the sun goes down, then the sun comes up. But you've nailed it. And there were 2 points raised by the drivers, a quite aggressive or quite emotive point, I think, raised by Lando Norris this week, who felt that the soft tyres were not in a position to deliver grip for the drivers on that final restart. And that was one of the reasons why there was so many accidents. But also Sergio Perez saying how difficult the sun was, which was face on, wasn't it? Down into that first corner, drivers missing their braking point and so on. And so, you know, you can talk about this last ditch stuff. You can talk about the energy that's going on and how they wanted a last chance saloon as much as you like. If they've not got grip underneath them and they can't see where they're going, you know, doesn't have to be very aggressive from the drivers and they'll end up crashing, you know. So I think there was a big factor of that where people are considering that drivers maybe were over aggressive, but just couldn't see and couldn't brake.
Right. And we started the race back in 2009, way before you were born, Alex. Back in 2009, we started the race at 5 p.m. local time. And I think even then it was decided this is a bit late. The drivers are really struggling to see. So I knew that there was probably going to be a factor going into turn one, because we were struggling, even just standing by the side of the road, let alone driving at 150 miles an hour into turn one.
It's an interesting one. I was in a Coma Cadet in 2009, but I'm flattered. And we have regulations. If there's fog, for example, in the specific regulation for fog is you have to be able to see from one marshal's post to the next, all the way around the track, and they actually test it. You see them testing it in the morning on a foggy morning. Go to a racetrack near you on a foggy morning if you're that way inclined, or you can just trust me. And they'll wave flags and then report whether the marshal on the next marshal post can see it. We don't have that kind of regulation now. I think about it for low sun, although it is equally blinding. It is equally tough. I've pitted cars at Le Mans before with bugs on the screen purely because I couldn't see where I was going. So a big challenge for the drivers, and correct for you to raise it, Sean. A question as to whether, a la I give you test match cricket, we should be considering whether we run that long and prevent the drivers being in that situation. Put a darker visor on and cope with it, lads, I reckon.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel your pain going down the A1 in the middle of winter. It's terrible, that sun factor. There's obviously many factors that can contribute to a driver mindset, not just many stoppages in a race. But Alex, what other factors can affect mindset, whether that's, teammate performance or how you perform at your home Grand Prix and so on?
Yeah, it interested me, the restart at the start. With the pace of the cars, more towards the start, 10 laps in, with the pace of the cars, realistically, for many drivers, given the difficulty in overtaking and the fact it's a one-stop race, at which point that stop has already happened because they've been able to change tyres under the safety car, is almost as last ditch as the one at the end. But somehow that lap count changes the psychology of the drivers and the way they approach it. And it got me really thinking about all of the other things that change drivers' psychology, whether their teammate is performing. For example, I do think a big factor of the performance of the drivers who've sat across from Max Verstappen is the pure strength of him in that team, or a driver like Oscar Piastri, who clearly felt massive home support and gathered up his first points this weekend. I've always done terribly at home, and then the further I am from my house, the better I do. I can plot it on a graph. So read into that what you will, Statman, and tell me what I need to improve.
I don't know if I can give you direct advice, but you have something in common with Jenson Button there, who had 50 career podiums in Formula One, won the World Championship, success across the board. Never on the podium in the British Grand Prix. That was always his bugbear. He had other drivers like Alain Prost, or Nigel Mansell or Lewis Hamilton these days, Michael Schumacher, who always seemed to have no problems performing at a home race. And Jenson Button, for the life of him, he could not buy a podium in the British Grand Prix. I'm sure he would have traded a few other podiums in his career, or even a few wins, just to have a podium in front of his home crowd.
It's a funny thing, isn't it? And I love I love diving into the psyche of a racing driver. So, Alex, you said yourself there, you've always struggled at your home races. Why do you think that is? What is it in your brain that's not quite clicking correctly to enable you to really make your stamp at a home race?
I know there's an element of extra pressure to it, but what always interests me with home races is everybody assumes, they take this view that, home racetrack, he'll be fast there, as though you're there, every 2 weeks racing, but you're not, are you? You're racing, if you're a Formula One driver, you're racing internationally for the last however many years you've been a Formula One, Formula Two, Formula Three driver. You've only raced at your home circuit as much as everyone else has, because you're doing the championship the same way as everyone else has. So I think it's a little bit of a misplaced theory, actually. At the same time, it comes with that little bit of extra pressure. Your family's there, and having that support around you can be very beneficial to a driver if your family are very beneficial to you, but can also add extra personal pressure. 200,000 people can be sitting trackside watching you, but if your mum thinks you did a rubbish job, then it really matters. No, but it really matters, doesn't it? And your family and everyone around you and your benefactor and sponsor who's looked after you since you were 8 years old in cadets. It's a big thing, and it's really easy, and it's a confidence game, right? It's a confidence game behind the wheel. So interesting to see how that affects the drivers.
It always comes back to the mums. Alex, lovely stuff. Thank you for all of that. Fascinating thoughts as ever. And remember, listeners, if you want to comment on anything Alex, Sean, or myself have to say, drop us a line on social media using hashtag Aramco F1 Focus. Right, moving on. It's now time for us to nerd out with some stats with Sean's Stat Focus. So, Sean, take it away. What are you going to talk about this time?
Well, of course, Australia 2023 will go down in history as the first race to be red flagged 3 times. I mean, we've had races where we've had 3 starts before. In fact, it was the 5th race we've ever had where we've had 3 standing starts. But it was the first race that's had 3 red flags and therefore 4 starts altogether. Of course, the final one was that safety car restart, which is kind of perfunctory at the end. But yeah, it's the 5th race in history we've had 3 standing starts. The first 2, if you're keeping score, was Austria 87 and Belgium 1990. Both races that were red flagged twice on the first lap. It was back in the day when you'd stop at the end of the first lap, and if it was red flagged, it'd be annulled, and we go back, as if that had never happened, and we'll start again. Mugello 2020, it happened when we had 2 red flags. We had a big pile up early on, and then Lance Stroll crashed when he had a puncture. And Jeddah 2021, it happened. It was a bit crash strewn at that first Jeddah race when Mick Schumacher crashed. Then we had another pile up early doors when we tried to get it restarted. So Australia 2023 will definitely go down in the history books for that part.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is an interesting one, and I'd be really interested to know how many of our listeners know the answer to this one already. What's the history of the red flag in Formula One, and when was it first displayed?
Well, that depends whether you consider Indianapolis to be a Formula One race. A lot of people consider the Indianapolis races, the first 11 World Championships featured the Indy 500, but there was not a Formula One race. It was not one Formula One regulations. It was run by USAC, but it counted towards the World Championship. So we tend to discount those. The 1950 Indianapolis 500 was red flagged due to rain, because of course it was an oval. They didn't race in the rain on the oval. So putting that aside, the first time we ever had a red flag in Formula One was the 1971 Canadian Grand Prix. And it's funny that Alex just mentioned the idea of mist and fog, obscuring Marshall's post, because that race was red flagged due to mist. The sight lines got too short. They couldn't see where they were going. So they red flagged that with like 25 laps to go, something like that. Soon after came one of the most notorious ones, which is the lap 1 red flag at Silverstone 73, which is often replayed, a YouTube classic, if you will, when Jody Scheckter spun, took half the field with him. That was the first ever red flag on the first lap. But early on, it was they were very reticent to stop the race. I mean, just think of the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix when Roger Williamson was killed in that accident. Of course, that was a race that should have been red flagged, but it just felt like, well, it's not what we do.
Do you think, as the years have progressed, that we're seeing more red flags than in past decades? Is that a fair comment?
Well, putting what I just said into context, I mean, we had in the last 57 races since Monza 2020, we've had 13 red flagged races out of 57. Now, putting that into context, that was as many red flags as we had in the first 30 years of the World Championship combined. So we've had as many red flags as in 30 years of Formula One in the past 57 races in 2.5 years. So we are definitely moving towards red flag society.
Do you think that is in some way? I mean, I'll be corrected here, and probably by you, Sean. But I'm thinking early 50s Le Mans 24 Hours, extremely bad crash. Mercedes tumbles into the crowd, and I remember the concept that race was not red flagged purely because the organisation of the race couldn't handle what would happen to the crowd and to the surrounding area. And if an event like that was ceased immediately ceased with immediate effect, and all the crowd suddenly left. Do you think now there are races in the past that, given modern technology, would likely have been red flagged, but purely at the time they literally were unable to deliver that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Le Mans disaster you referred to in 55, it was when Pierre Olivier crashed with Lance Macklin. It is often reported that race was not stopped because if they stopped the race, people would leave and they would clog up the roads and they couldn't get they couldn't get the ambulances in and out, which is actually quite an honourable reason to keep the race running. If you think about it, we want to actually try and help people here. Yeah, there is plenty of races that would have been stopped on that basis if we'd had all that planned out in advance these days. I mean, even I mentioned Zandvoort 73. The reason that race wasn't stopped was because in the race control centre, they didn't have the TV coverage. So what we saw, the horror on TV, was not seen in race control. All they saw was a column of black smoke, and that was all they knew about it from the other side of the track. But another thing is that the rules about red flags have evolved down the years. It used to be, for instance, that we would stop the race and then restart the race, and the two periods were added together. Aggregate time would determine the winner. There were 11 races in history that were determined on aggregate time. The first one was actually the only race in history that was deliberately run in 2 heats, and that was Germany 1959. And believe it or not, this plus ça change, ladies and gentlemen, it was run in 2 heats on purpose because they were concerned about the life of the tyres. They weren't sure that the tyres were going to last on the banking of the Aarhus track, which is the only year they ever ran at Aarhus, the German Grand Prix. So they ran it in 2 heats. Most of the other times it was rain or it was an accident on the circuit. Mexico 87, the person who was first across the line at the end, Nelson Piquet, was not the winner of the race because Nigel Mansell had a big enough lead in the first heat that he actually won it on aggregate time. The race in which Ayrton Senna was killed, San Marino 94, obviously this is little recorded fact, but that was an aggregate time race because obviously it was red flagged after 5 laps. And then the last one was Japan 94, that famous battle between Damon Hill and Michael Schumacher in the rain. It was drying out in Japan and Damon Hill held on by 3.36 seconds, as Murray Walker famously exclaimed as Michael Schumacher came across the line to stop the clock.
Wow. I mean, don't bring back the heats is all I can say. Now, Sean, I know you love an anomaly and you love a record book. Have red flags caused any anomalies in the record books as time's gone on?
Oh boy, you had to ask. Yes, they have. There's quite a few down the years. I mean, there's this famous story which I would love to be true. Sadly, I never got to ask him if it's true. Maybe someone else could tell me. But Niki Lauda, when he crashed at Germany in 1976, it was on the second lap of the race. Now, even though it was a 14-mile track, if the race was red flagged before the end of lap 2, it was restarted afresh. Well, of course, Lauda was in hospital by the time they restarted afresh. So officially, he was accredited as did not start in that race. And he's supposed to have argued the point with the journalists saying, if I didn't start that race, what happened to my ear? Which is a fair point when you think about it. I mean, how on earth could he have got those burns in a race he didn't start?
Well, where he made it to, sorry to cut across your job, but where he made it to as well is a long way round, because obviously the corner now where that incident happened is called Lauda. Where he made it to is a tremendously far way around the racetrack.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's pretty much as far away as you can get from the pit lane at the Nürburgring. But that's one of many anomalies. Mike Thackwell became the youngest driver ever to start a Grand Prix in Canada 1980, or did he? Because there was a pile up at the start of the race. His teammate needed his car because his car was wrecked in the first start, and that meant Thackwell didn't take the restart, and he didn't start another race for another 4 years. So it was always, did Thackwell? Is he the youngest starter or not? So that lasted a long time. Nigel Mansell crashed at Adelaide in 91, which was the shortest Grand Prix in history until Spa 2021. And he broke bones in his foot, but it was red flagged like the next lap. So the results were counted 2 laps earlier. Mansell got a podium. He finished second, even though he was on the way to hospital and he wasn't on the podium physically. But he was second in the race, even though he was in the wall by the time that all happened. Then there's a big one. That's Spa 2001. This is anomalous in the present day in the record books, because in that race, out of the rules of the time, if you had a red flag, they changed it so there wasn't aggregate time anymore. They just annulled everything that had happened before and started another race with the grid set by whatever the positions were when they stopped the previous part. So 8 laps in, there was this big crash between Luciano Berti and Eddie Irvine. Everyone who was out of the race in that segment was considered to be did not start in the second segment. So Kimi Raikkonen and Fernando Alonso, who are the two most experienced drivers of all time, both lost one start off their official total because they were out in the first segment. And because they restarted it and considered the first segment null and void, Alonso's starting total, which is now the record for the most starts in history, is one less than it should be. He actually started that race, but he was out before the red flag came out. So there are anomalies caused by these ever-changing red flag regulations down the years. It kind of drives me a bit nuts. I know it's not a big deal right now, but if we get to some point in the future where, Max Verstappen's about to pass Alonso's record and he stops, and he's tied with him, you might say, hang on a minute, Alonso had this one start 25 years ago.
The thing I know, because you're kind enough to do so, Sean, is that you will be on the Statman feed delivering that information live to all of the commentary boxes as well. So you're going to have to make a decision like that about whether it's real or...
You might get a lengthy rant appearing on the monitor in front of you that you might have to spend time reading while you're trying to actually do commentary.
Sean, the angry stat man, you have outdone yourself with statistics in that little segment there. That's fantastic stuff. But I'm not going to let you get away with just the one focus on red flags. Have you got another one for us?
Well, it's interesting that we've got, Fernando Alonso, who was all set to go to the old people's home a few years ago. It come out of, I don't want to say he's come out of retirement, but from a competitive standpoint, it's like he's back from the dead and suddenly is running at the sharp end after 10 years away. Labouring in midfield. The podium that we had in Australia was the second oldest podium average age that we've had in the past 28 years. Now, it might seem quite benign, but in this era of Formula One, all we're seeing is age is getting younger and younger. So it's quite anomalous to see a podium that old. In fact, Valencia 2012 was the only one older in that time when Michael Schumacher took his last podium. And Alonso was on that podium too, along with Kimi Raikkonen. To find an older podium, you have to go back to Adelaide 94 when it was Mansell, Berger and Martin... What was that guy's name? Martin... somebody help me. What was the guy's name?
No, I can't tell you. No.
Never heard of him.
There was another guy in third, but it was Berger, Mansell, and Brundle. That was who it was. So,
that guy.
Yeah, but to continue the point, I mean, Alonso, when he came into Formula One in 2003, the record for the youngest podium ever was Belgium 1974. Right, it was Emerson Fittipaldi, Niki Lauda, and Jody Scheckter, which was 25 years old. It had stood for 29 years. That was exactly 20 years ago. That race is now 35th. So that gives you an idea of how much younger that we've got since sort of the Alonso Raikkonen era began in 2003. I mean, we've only had 4 drivers over the age of 40 in the 21st century. There's Schumacher, there's Kimi Raikkonen, and there's special bonus points to anybody who correctly identified Pedro de la Rosa, who's the pointless answer in that one if you can find it. But everything always trends younger. We've had 12 drivers over 40 in the past half a century. And if you compare that with where we started, Silverstone 1950, in that race, there were 8 drivers over the age of 40, and there was 3 drivers over the age of 50. We've had 6 drivers in Formula One who were born in the 19th century. So, it is, old drivers. If you want old driver records, you've got to go way, way back to the early days of Formula One because you won't get anywhere near them now.
And on that subject, let's put you on the spot. Who is the oldest driver ever to race in Formula One?
Well, assuming everyone's birth certificate is accurate, Louis Chiron, who went on to become the clerk of the course for the Monaco Grand Prix, raced in Monaco. Actually, raced in the first Monaco Grand Prix that was part of the championship in 1950. Was on the podium in that race. He was the only Monegasque on the podium to Charles Leclerc. He raced in 1955, and he was 55 years old in that race. Now, an interesting anomaly there was another driver in that race called Cesare Perdisa, who was 22 years old. And he had not been born when Chiron won the Monaco Grand Prix of 1931. So that was an instance where there was somebody racing against another driver who was not born when he had competed in that race previously. Now, that had not happened between 2 drivers in the World Championship era until this season when Oscar Piastri raced against Fernando Alonso, because Alonso made his F1 debut a month before Piastri was born.
Well, I assume that at some point this year we might have another record, because if you replace Verstappen on the podium in Australia, then you really are moving up into well over 100 years old for the podium. So we'll see what happens there. Let's leave it for there now, Sean. Thank you very much. Alex and I were literally in statistical heaven there. I mean, that was a joy to behold. And we will, of course, be diving into your limitless stat pool again next time. We're rounding the final corner now and heading onto the home straight, which as ever is our Aramco Focus, the area of the show where we shine a light on a subject you might not know too much about. Now, you might know that earlier this year in Bahrain, Formula 2 and Formula 3 took the first major step in Formula 1's plan to move to 100% sustainable synthetic fuels with the competitive debut of Aramco-supplied spec fuels containing 55% sustainable biosource materials. But you might be wondering, what exactly are sustainable and synthetic fuels? Well, here's Pierre Olivier Calendini, Director of Aramco's Fuel Research Centre, to explain all.
Aramco, as every company, is concerned by the climate change. And then, as R&D, we are investing into technology to reduce the carbon footprint. And synthetic fuel is one of technology that can reduce the carbon footprint for the transport. They are nearly the same. Synthetic fuel or fossil fuel is hydrocarbon. And so we value the hydrocarbon. But when we produce synthetic fuel, we are not starting from petrol. We are starting from hydrogen and CO2. And we combine together to get hydrocarbons. So in terms of chemical property, they are nearly the same. It's just the way where we do or we made the fuel is different. Low carbon fuel is a generic term we use to differentiate our fuel compared to regular fossil fuel. For synthetic fuel, we are starting with hydrogen and CO2 and to build the molecules for the synthetic fuel. And then when it's burned, the CO2 is released in the atmosphere, and we are closing the loop, and we have neutral or nearly neutral CO2 emission. F2, F3, now we have developed a fuel that will stand for 2 years, 2023 and 2024. And we will, starting in 2025, 2026, to introduce synthetic components with an ultimate target to go with a full synthetic fuel in 2027. We are working also on engine efficiency or on system to reduce the emission for the combustion engine. And so all of this will contribute to prepare technology to support the carbon reduction of the transport in the coming years.
So that was Pierre Olivier Calendini, Director of Aramco's Fuel Research Centre, and we'll be hearing more about F1's journey to 100% sustainable synthetic fuels in future episodes. Well, that's about it for episode 2, but we'll be back with you again in a few weeks' time. In the meantime, be sure to like, follow, or subscribe to the Race F1 Tech Show podcast feed to ensure you never miss an episode of that podcast or this one. Alex, before we go, what's your focus going to be on over the next few weeks? Have you got anything fun planned for us?
Well, I'm on track 3 or 4 times over the next few weeks, just swatting up, on the apexes, and then I'm swatting up on Formula 3 and Formula 2 again for Baku.
Sounds great. And Sean, what about you?
I'm going to be nervously awaiting to see what rules we're going to be using in Baku. Is it going to be a sprint qualifying and a sprint race? Is it going to be a qualifying and a sprint and a... Yeah. So basically what I'm saying is I'm hoping that the driver who's in first position on the starting grid for the Grand Prix does actually get awarded pole position, so I don't have to visit my psychologist again like I did after Interlagos.
We don't want that. Terrific stuff. Thank you both, as ever, for joining me for some more red-hot, stat-tastic F1 chat. Until next time, it's goodbye from Alex.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from Sean.
Bye.
And goodbye from me. Goodbye.
The Athletic.